This is just a compilation of Aristotle's works, but this is the one I'm going to be reading, which is Politics. If you just go to Google and Google Politics free PDF, you're going to get at least the one I clicked on. It's so it's a free book, obviously, but the translation is a little different than the one that I'm reading. So the one I'm reading is, as it says here, translated by Benjamin Jowett. So, just so you know, that's the book I'm reading. That translation is the one I'm reading. So according to this version, there are 8 books, and so far I'm on book number 2. I finished all of book number 1, which is what I'm going to cover in today's video. Okay, before I get into the book, let me mention why I decided to read Politics. Like Plato, Aristotle wished for an effective form of government that would rationally direct human affairs. Unlike Plato, he did not seek an ideal state based on the embodiment of an ideal form of justice, but tried to find the best form of government by a rational examination of existing governments. For his Politics, Aristotle examined the constitution of 158 states and arrived at general categories for organizing governments. He identified 3 good forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and constitutional government. But based on his examination, he warned that monarchy can easily turn into tyranny, aristocracy into oligarchy, and constitutional government into radical democracy or anarchy. He favored constitutional government as the best form for most people. So the main thing is the fact that he studied 158 constitutions in Greece, and from that, objectively speaking, just I guess he took a rational approach. Like what did the book say? By rational examination of existing governments. So to me, that was just common sense. It's like, if you're gonna, even right now in 2025 in present day, if I want to know what the best form of government is, because I watch a lot of debates and a lot of people, some people are communists, and I see a lot of debates, like I think Jubilee is one of those channels where they have 20 people versus one communist, or 20 capitalists versus a communist, or vice versa. And they had Patrick Bet-David, a capitalist, debate a bunch of, I think, socialists. So things like this are very, to me, it seemed like, okay, we seem to disagree a lot. There are very smart people on both sides, and it seems like they disagree 100%. So how about, what's the objective way of determining which is actually the best form of government? To me, it seemed, instead of just theorizing about which is how capitalism is the best way of living, or theorizing about why socialism or communism is actually better, and instead of imagining things or debating ideas, why not actually object more on the kind of like the scientific method, actually observe, objectively speaking, different existing, there's been history, we have recorded history for years, thousands of years. So why not just look back and see, of all the governments that have been tried, which ones actually were useful, which ones were really bad. So when I read that from my world history book, that this had already been done, Aristotle already did this, and he thought this already 2,000 years ago, and he did the he did the work of actually studying different constitutions, 158, and then coming to his conclusion. To me, just seemed like, I get why Aristotle is very very influential. Yeah, just common sense. So that's why I wanted to read Politics. So all right, so now let's get into the actual book, and I'm going to cover book number 1. So a quick summary of book number 1. The first thing that stood out to me was the fact that, even though, so the book is called Politics, but in the content of at least so far book number 1 seemed to not have, I won't say that it didn't have anything to do with, but they were topics that I was not expecting would be covered in Politics. So, when I heard about politics, I would think, okay, maybe there's going to be mentions of loss, or mentions of how this government did this, and then this was the outcome, therefore it's bad. But I mean, so far in book number 1, he talks about slavery and masters and the relationship between them. He talks about his beliefs, Aristotle's beliefs of the role of a woman and how she is different from a man. In fact, there's a part where he says that women are inferior. I think he uses those words to men, and that she's supposed to be the supporter of the man, something like that. And he also mentions the relationship. He compares the relationship between a man and a woman, or a man and his children, to forms of government. For example, he says something like, the relationship between the man and his wife is closer to a democracy, whereas the relationship between a man and his children is more of a oligarchy or something like that. So he's comparing human to human relationships, and here's making an analogy or comparing them to governments. And I just thought that was interesting. And by the way, I just want to say something really quick when it comes to what I said about him not liking, or him mentioning that women are inferior, or from what he says later on. I'll read some of the quotes, but I'm giving you a summary right now. But you'll see some of the quotes where he pretty much seems to make a case for slavery, or at least saying that some people are supposed to be slaves and some people are born to be masters. First of all, this is just one book of Aristotle that I'm reading right now, and obviously he lived in different times, so it's, I'm not going to read it as a what's the word, in a very subjective manner in the present day of 2025 in the US. I'm aware that this happened years ago, and that the world ran it in a different way. So I'm not going to cast judgment irrationally. So, which is, by the way, this book, Alexander the Great. I might put that quote up there later, but that's what the author of that biography mentions, how he's analyzing. In him writing the biography of Alexander the Great, he says pretty much what I just told you, which is, I'm not going to read it. I'm not going to write as a as a person judging him. We got to be aware that this was a different time, and I'm not going to judge him. I'm going to give it to you as objectively as possible, something like that. So that's pretty much how I'm approaching what I'm reading from Aristotle. So, okay. All right, so here's the actual quote. He deserves to be measured against the values of his own time and not of ours. My intention is to understand rather than to praise or to condemn. So pretty much that's the way I'm approaching reading Aristotle. I'll just get into the actual content of the book now. So I'm going to go over different highlights, different things I've highlighted, and just give you my commentary. So I think that's the easiest way. I highlight a lot of things, but I don't know if I'll cover everything in this video. But all right, so first of all, this is from book 1, as I said. This is the first highlight. All right, so it's a short sentence or two. For that which can foresee by the exercise of mind is by nature intended to be lord and master, and that which can with its body give effect to such foresight is a subject, and by nature a slave. All right, so like I said earlier, when I was giving you a summary of the book, of book number 1, we got right into it. It's about slavery. So why did I highlight that? Well, anything having to do with slavery and freedom, let's just say slavery. Anything having to do with slavery has always stood out to me. So one quick example. So I read Frederick Douglass' autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which when was this published? Back in like 1845, maybe, somewhere in there. I don't think that's exactly right, but somewhere in the 1800s. And So for those of you, quick summary, who might not know who Frederick Douglass is, he's very popular. Obviously, I feel like everybody in the U.S. pretty much knows who he was. So, just an American slave who lived as a slave, was born as a slave, lived as a slave, and then eventually in his 20s, I think he was maybe 24 or something like that, he decided to escape. He actually attempted to escape slavery twice, to escape the South. And he got betrayed the first time, and then the second time he actually made it through. And by the way, in his book, he even mentions that he's not explained, because people asked him, how did you escape all the time? And he says, I will not tell anybody how I actually escaped, so that those who are already still there in slavery may have the potential to also escape. So I'm not even going to give any details. So he doesn't even go into any details, at least in his first autobiography, which is the popular one. There's 3, I think, he wrote. But anyway, so I read that book because I was very interested in how, a slave, life is difficult, right? So I obviously, I live in the U.S. in 2025. There's no slavery. I'm not a slave. But I do work a job, and I do see the constrictions that there are with working a job, with having to, not, maybe I don't have as much money as I would like, right? So I'm realizing, okay, there's certain things I can't say in the workplace, or I can't do. I gotta, somebody, let's say my boss or someone of authority is trying to push me around, or trying to bully me, or trying to be rude or put me down. I realized that I can't just walk away because I need the income, right? Or if I leave this job, I need to go to another job. So I'm not saying that it's slavery, but I am saying that I felt, with different jobs I've had, I've realized, okay, there's some things I cannot do, some constrictions. So if I'm already feeling these constrictions in the U.S. in 2025, in one of, as they say, the freest country in the world, now how about let me go back to, what would an actual slave do? What would they think? How did they actually live? And how did they actually escape actual slavery to become free and successful? And that's why I decided to read Frederick Douglass, his book. And so I was just very interested in slavery and the mentality of a slave. And it's a really good book. I'm going to make another video on just that book and what I remember, what I've read, what stood out, because there's a lot of good stuff from that. There's actually an article I might link it on this description. I might just do it on the next one, on the video that I'll make on Frederick Douglass. But it's a really good article. I'm surprised there were no comments. I was the only comment on that one. But somebody wrote a nice, really good article on Frederick Douglass, and he compared that to the workplace nowadays. And I'm not making like a comparison as in we're slaves, but taking lessons from his autobiography, and then applying them to present day in the U.S. or in the world today. So that was a really good article. I really like the guy who wrote it. But okay, going back to the quote. So slavery. Why did that stand out to me? It's just something I'm interested in. How do people become slaves? Have there always been slaves? I don't want to be a slave. Nobody likes slavery, but how can we escape that? So that just stood out to me. All right, let me go to the next quote. So I highlighted the word village. So that's because Aristotle, one of the things he does here is he categorizes, he talks about a society or a state. What makes a state? What are the different levels of a state? How is a state formed, or a country per se? So he says the smallest unit is he divides it into different levels. So the smallest unit is the individual, just one person. Then there is the household, and those are the terms he uses. And the individual, the household, which is composed of either master and slave, or master and slave and wife and kids. So pretty much the nuclear family and the person that's there to help get things done, who's the slave. And so that's the household. The next level after that is the village. Is that right? Household, yeah, village. and that's just a group, just a group of households. And after the village, once there are enough, the population grows enough, then that will form what is called a state. And one of the things Aristotle mentions is that even though intuitively we would think the most important, I think, I can't remember what it says, I didn't highlight this part, but he talks about what's the purpose of a state, or what's the highest priority of a state. And I can't remember, I should have highlighted it, but he says something like that. What's the priority of a state? Is it the individual that should take priority, or should it be the state in general that should take priority? And contrary to what I thought, what a lot of people would think, that, well, yeah, the individual takes priority because the whole thing depends on individuals, right, who make up the state. But he says it's the opposite. He said, no, the state takes priority. The state is what is the foundation, not the individual. So when we build a, okay, I guess in building a state, the focus should be on the whole state, not on the individuals. Hopefully that makes, that's pretty much all it says. I'm sure it'll get more into that, but that's pretty much why I highlighted the word village, just to separate the categories. So the next highlight is I highlighted the words political animal. So I'm just going to read that first sentence. Hence, it is evident that the state is a creation of nature, and that man is by nature a political animal. And the reason I highlighted that is because at least I see that in my life. And I know not everybody is political, or they talk about politics all the time, but I feel like, for example, me and like my brother, they're around the same time, like 18 through like 20, early 20s, we started being more interested in politics. It wasn't that nobody told us to be interested in politics. We just naturally were interested in that. So I highlighted it pretty much to just as a reminder that, oh yeah, I see that in my life, that I for sure am a political animal. So I can see that. The next highlight is this: nature, as we often say, makes nothing in vain. So that's that's a claim that feels right to me, but I feel like some people would debate that, or it's kind of like a moral claim, or some claim that it's probably very debatable. But to me, I don't know, I just like that part, because I'd say I agree with that. For example, we have hands, we have fingers, we have nails. Everything has a purpose. So nature makes nothing in vain. And going back to, again, that's why he's saying that. I in my mind, I'm like, okay, that's why he's justifying what he said about how some men are naturally meant to be slaves, and some are naturally meant to be masters. Okay, so the next highlight is this: the proof that the state is a creation of nature and prior to the individual is that the individual, when isolated, is not self-sufficing. All right, and then connected to that is another highlight I put right here. A social instinct is implanted in all men by nature. Okay, so the reason I highlighted that is, I'd say I agree. So again, seeing back in my life, and when I have been, say, depressed, or just feeling very down, very sad, long periods of time depressed, one of the things that goes hand in hand with depression is isolation, right? So sometimes people who are depressed, one of the things they do is they just isolate themselves. There was a guy in my high school who actually, and I read the article on what it said, and he, one of the things it says that, yeah, he was, I knew the guy. He was good looking. He was popular. He was in sports. I think he was a football player. Yet I think it was a junior or senior year, or sometime in there. And to me, it was odd, because he in my mind, he had pretty much everything. But anyway, on the article it said that he had slowly stopped going to events. So, for example, his family or his friends would go, hey, let's go over here for, I don't know, some game or whatever. And he slowly stopped going to those games. And he said at first they didn't think much of it. He's just, okay, well, he's a teenager. He doesn't want to go. Okay, that's fine. But, eventually the whole point is that he started to isolate himself from his friends and from his family. So to me, it just seemed very important because I've seen that in my experience, in my life. When I've been depressed, I tend to isolate myself, which is not what you're supposed to do, even though it's hard not to do that. But I started to isolate myself. When I've seen that with the guy, my classmate, and I've seen that with other close family members or friends, that I've seen that as well. And so I just reminds me that we are social animals, and Aristotle knew this way back, and it's easy to avoid being a social animal. And here's the thing, and this is another reason why I highlighted it, is that it says pretty much that you're not self-sufficient. If you're by yourself, you're not really self-sufficient. So that's why we have to be social animals, so that we can, help each other, not out of altruism, but trade. For example, we do business with each other. Hey, I have this, you have that. Let's make a trade. There's a social interaction right there. Even the way I would claim it is, even negative interactions are still social interactions. So, whenever this is a stretch, which I'm not gonna necessarily say I 100% agree, but this is a thought that I had when I highlighted this, which is that depression happens when people isolate themselves. Depression happens when you stop having social interactions. And that's why when you see somebody, for example, being bullied, I'm thinking of like my own experience when I was younger, or different people I saw. When the person is being bullied, there's two things people do. When you're being bullied, either you fight back right away. I had a friend who was like that, even though he may not win the fight, but he would fight back and defend himself and say something. And then there's the other people that was mostly me, who were like, okay, well, I'll just avoid the person. Oh, there's the bully walking over there. Let me avoid him, And that's because you're avoiding social interaction with the bully. And you might say, okay, how's that you're avoiding social interaction? Well, yes, having a verbal confrontation with the bully is some kind of social interaction, because you are interacting with another human being, so it is social. It doesn't mean it has to be positive. It doesn't mean it has to be pleasant, but it is a social interaction. So the depressed person, the guy who fights back against the bully, they're not really depressed. They may get beat up, they may fight, but they're this is my experience in my mind. What I'm thinking is, I don't think they're really depressed. The person who's depressed is the one who avoids the bully, and therefore avoids the confrontation, avoids the social interaction with the bully because it's difficult, and decides to isolate him or herself. So it's just a thought that came to my mind as I was reading that. Don't know if it's true or not. I'm sure, one of the things I like to do also, I like to read psychology books. One of the books I'm reading right now is The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. It's called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So it's a very interesting book. So the more I read psychology books, I think I'll be able to actually get more background information to know whether or not my hypothesis is true about people who are depressed and who avoid social interactions. But anyway, that's why I highlighted it. Going back to the book, pretty much saying that you're not self-sufficing, as the book says, when isolated is not self-sufficing. Individual, when isolated, is not self-sufficing. And I think that is very true. And this is going to be, I'm going to go on the last, this is going to be the last highlight I'm going to go over in this video, because it's already pretty long. But, okay, so this last one is just gluttony, which pretty much means people who are obsessed with eating a lot. Pretty much like if you're obese because it's just like an addiction, you just eat a lot, that's gluttony. So I just highlighted it because it just stood out. It just seemed kind of odd. So the context is I'm just gonna read the sentence and then you can see. Wherefore, if he have not virtue, he is the most unholy and the most savage of animals, and the most full of lust and gluttony. So lust, obviously, everybody, the Bible says it's bad, right? Everybody would agree, okay, yeah, that's a bad thing. Gluttony, the reason I highlighted it is because I've heard like sermons of, at church where pastors have mentioned that. And I've read other stuff where gluttony is mentioned as a sin or as a bad thing. And to me, it seemed kind of silly, or just, not necessarily silly. It just seemed odd, kind of funny. Like, so it just seemed like a sin that doesn't seem too much like a sin. Somebody who eats a lot. But so I was more curious as to why. Maybe I'll do some research as to why that's something that is in people's mind as a sin or as a really bad thing. Which obviously it is bad to eat a lot, to the point that you're unhealthy and you're maybe just addicted to food instead of solving problems. If you're using it as a way to avoid problems. But to me, it just seems kind of very like a silly sin or an odd sin. So that's why I just highlighted it. All right, so that'll be all for right now. I'll continue on the next highlights another time.